What's up, everybody? How are you guys doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel, and today we have to talk about this crazy news about Call of Duty finally making its way to Nintendo consoles. Now, this was a story that started popping up like crazy late last night here in the States when out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, Phil Spencer of Microsoft tweeted that they are making a commitment to bring Call of Duty to Nintendo platforms for 10 years. This is huge news for so many reasons, and obviously it's in relation to the proposed deal between Microsoft and Activision that is currently being reviewed by regulators and hoping to close in June next year, so about 6 or so months from right now. And Call of Duty has very much been at the forefront of this conversation, partly because Sony has been pushing back and really trying to stop this thing from happening. They have really exposed that they're pretty terrified to not have Call of Duty available on PlayStation. And so, this new piece of news comes out that says Microsoft is willing to also bring it to Nintendo. Phil Spencer's initial tweet reads as this: Microsoft has entered into a 10-year commitment to bring Call of Duty to Nintendo following the merger of Microsoft and Activision Blizzard King. Microsoft is committed to helping bring more games to more people, however they choose to play. He goes on to say that Steam and Steam Deck and whatnot is also part of the deal, which is fine and certainly good to hear. Now, Brad Smith, who's a chairman and president of Microsoft, also had this to say in his own tweet. He said, "Our acquisition will bring Call of Duty to more gamers and more platforms than ever before. That's good for competition and good for consumers. Thank you, Nintendo. Any day Sony wants to sit and talk, we'll be happy to hammer out a 10-year deal for PlayStation as well." Ooh, man, he's kind of just sticking that knife in and twisting it a little bit into Sony. It's pretty crazy. Now, as I already said here, and as would probably be obvious to most of us who follow this kind of news anyway, not only is this a huge deal, but there are a lot of major implications to this happening. First and foremost is the fact that Call of Duty will be returning to Nintendo platforms after more than a decade by the time a game would probably release, right? Sometimes people forget that Call of Duty did have a nice solid run on Nintendo platforms for a while. Going back to, I think, the GameCube, there was Call of Duty, I think it was Call of Duty 3. It was either 2 or 3, and I'm pretty sure it was Call of Duty 3. I think it was a GameCube game. There were a couple of games on the Wii. There was World at War. They made the first Black Ops game, and Modern Warfare 3 came to the Wii. And then, of course, Call of Duty Black Ops 2 and Ghosts came to the Wii U. Ghosts was the last time a Call of Duty game appeared on a Nintendo platform. There was even some DS games, by the way. I believe there was a couple of DS. I don't think there were any 3DS games. I might look that up and confirm. But for sure, the last time it happened for Nintendo was Ghosts on the Wii U, which I thought was 2014, but actually I think it was 2013 that Ghosts came to the Wii U. And Black Ops 2 was amazing on the Wii U. Ghosts was certainly very good. It wasn't the best Call of Duty game, but I still enjoyed it on the Wii U. And so there was a time where Call of Duty was coming to Nintendo platforms, both in the standard definition era and 2 games releasing in the HD era on the Wii U. Then after Call of Duty Ghosts in 2013, Call of Duty went silent on Nintendo platforms. Nothing released on the Wii U after that, and nothing has been released on the Switch since, which is absolutely preposterous if you think about it. Given how well the Switch has sold and how many great third-party games have managed to do pretty well on the console, it's surprising. Obviously, you have to spend some extra time and maybe hire out a separate port studio to bring certain games to the Switch because the hardware we know just isn't as capable as, you know, the PS4 and Xbox One or the now PS5 and Series X. It just isn't as capable. So some extra work has to go into it. But still, you can get games like Resident Evil games and Doom and Wolfenstein and The Witcher and Crysis and all these other games. You can bring them to the Switch if you spend the time and money and port it appropriately to the hardware. Nevertheless, that didn't happen, and the huge install base of the Switch was never added to Call of Duty's already insane sales. But now, with this merger, 6 months away, if it gets approved and if it goes through in June next year, will officially, apparently, be bringing Call of Duty to Nintendo platforms for 10 years. Now, there's a couple of questions we have to ask ourselves here, such as, does this 10 years start with the first game that releases on the console, and then the 10-year timer starts to start? Or does it start as soon as the deal is done between Microsoft and Activision, if that goes through in June, and no matter how long it takes to release that first game on a Nintendo platform, has the 10-year timer already started? That's the question. My assumption is that it would start with the first game. We then, of course, have to ask how they would port it to the Nintendo platform of their choice. Would they be using a separate port studio? Would it have to be developed independently amongst the Sony and Microsoft competing versions? Or would there be a way to make it all for the same and then adjust it for the Nintendo platform? There might also be a scenario where that wouldn't be necessary, and I'll get to that in a minute. You know, how they would develop it is definitely part of it. And then, of course, I think the last main question is how long it would take, once the deal between Microsoft and Activision is done, for the first game to make it to a Nintendo platform. My assumption, and based on some of the things Phil Spencer has kind of said, is that it would probably take a year or two before the first game would officially release on the console once this deal is done. And actually, I lied. There is even another question I have when I read this information, is what does this commitment mean? This doesn't necessarily sound like it's a signed, done deal and an official contract agreement between Microsoft and Activision and Nintendo. This might be a verbal commitment between Phil Spencer and or Microsoft, along with Nintendo and Activision, right? All the main players. This could just be a verbal commitment. They don't necessarily say that this is an actual agreement, you know, a contract or anything like that. Now, it might be, and the verbiage just might not be telling us that, but I just wanted to point out that we don't truly know how far this commitment, quote unquote, really goes. Is this a promise, or is this a signed, done deal under the assumption that the acquisition goes through? And I think that's an important distinction to make. What happens if the deal goes through, but this is a verbal commitment that ends up not actually happening? That could play out, although I wouldn't expect it, so I thought it was worth bringing that up. At the end of the day, I think it's okay for us to assume, for the sake of this conversation, that this basically just is a real commitment, and that if this acquisition goes through, this is a real thing that will happen. Microsoft will bring Call of Duty games and Activision to Nintendo platforms for 10 years. Phil Spencer is being truthful. It's a real thing that is going to happen. I'm going to go on that assumption for the rest of this video and conversation. And so if that happens, then what about the other questions I asked? What does this all look like? Well, like I said, I think that this 10 years will probably begin with the first game that would release on a Nintendo platform, which brings us to the next biggest piece to this, and the part that you know I am the most excited to talk about. And it's the fact that, you guys, there is a great chance. It's not 100%. I never talk to you guys in absolutes, right? Okay, I don't pull the Sith nonsense. I'm not talking to you in absolutes. I'm just talking to you as a fan who's speculating and theorizing and has, 35, almost 40 years worth of gaming history under my belt. And when I look at what's going on and I analyze the situation, there is a great chance that the first Call of Duty game will actually come to the next Nintendo platform and not the Switch, or at least not just the Switch. If you think about it, there's already been people talking this year about when the next Nintendo hardware will come out, if it's going to be a Switch 2, if it's going to be a super powerful Switch Pro, if it's going to be another device that doesn't necessarily do the Switch hybrid thing. Whatever it is, a lot of people assume that Nintendo's already working and planning to release and reveal their next big piece of hardware, their next gen tech. And as you guys know, I've already been predicting it for 2 years to happen next year in 2023. So if there's any truth to that, if being the optimal word, and we think that in June next year, 6 months from now, this acquisition goes through, and then they're going to start working on the first Call of Duty that becomes a Nintendo Call of Duty. Well, again, this is just my theory, but I think it's going to be a year or two before we'd see that game release. And so I think there's a phenomenal chance that the first time a Call of Duty game is ready to release on a Nintendo platform, that the next hardware is already going to be out on the market. So does that mean that maybe even Microsoft, Activision, Phil Spencer already knows what Nintendo's next hardware is? If it's really around the corner next year, or even if it's 2024, then in theory, those dev kits and conversations should be happening amongst Nintendo and other developers already, right? Again, just speculating. I could be wrong, but this is just what I believe. And so if that's happening, then maybe part of the reason this becomes more exciting and even more possible for Call of Duty to come to Nintendo platforms is they might already know what Nintendo is working on, how capable it is, the window it might release in, and so it could be even easier for Microsoft to make this commitment to say, oh yeah, we're going to bring Call of Duty to Nintendo platforms too, because they already know something more capable and easy to develop for could be out by the time this first game would be ready. And so if 2024 or 25 is the time the first Call of Duty game is going to come to a Nintendo platform, I mean, is the Switch going to be the only console on the market? I don't think so. And of course, this is all just speculation, but it's exciting speculation, and to me, I think it makes sense. Some people have pointed out that, they mention Activision, Blizzard, King, and King, I believe, is the mobile developer who also made like a mobile Call of Duty game. And people have said, oh, you could bring the mobile Call of Duty to the Switch. And so maybe there is something to that. Maybe they bring a mobile version of Call of Duty to the current Switch, and then the next main real console Call of Duty comes to the next hardware. Or maybe they spend a lot of extra time and money to make sure that a next-gen and a Switch version of the next Call of Duty comes, and they just kind of pull like a double release thing, It's not impossible. The only thing is, I think they'd have to develop them very differently, right? You're not developing one Call of Duty for Nintendo at that point. You would technically be developing two, because the Switch is very underpowered in old tech, and I think you would need a unique port studio just to make a less good version of that game work on the Switch, whereas you'd have the superior normal version running on a theorized next-gen Nintendo console. And so it's tough to say. I mean, the install base of the Switch is so huge, you don't want to ignore it, but is it worth the extra money to make a unique version when you could just release a regular version on the next hardware? It's all theoretical, but to me, that's how I'm looking at this, and I think it's very interesting to see how this will actually happen. Obviously, the Sony thing is a little bit interesting to analyze too, because we know Sony has been a little bit difficult through these times. They've been very vocal. Sony and Jim Ryan have been very vocal about pushing back against this acquisition. They're terrified of losing Call of Duty. They're scared of the competition. And look, I love Sony. I like Sony and the PlayStation more than I like Microsoft and the Xbox, okay? Let me be real. I own them all, and I play on them all, but in my ranking, in my personal life, I prefer playing on Sony and PlayStation consoles to Xbox. But Sony has been really kind of lame about this whole thing. They're so terrified of the competition, and they already have a great lineup of first-party games, and so it's like, if you're so afraid of losing Call of Duty, I mean, they've already committed to giving you a couple of years of releases anyway, but if you're so afraid of losing Call of Duty, then just keep making your own first-party games and also develop new ones. Develop your own competition for when Call of Duty is no longer available. You clearly have a 3 to 5 year runway of that anyway. They've already committed to the current existing agreement that says Call of Duty will be coming to PlayStation for a couple of years. So it's very frustrating to me that Sony, a company that I like, has been really kind of weak about this whole thing and pushing back so hard. And I find it interesting that as Sony has continued to make things difficult, Nintendo has been completely silent, at least publicly. And now it comes out that Microsoft is willing to bend over backwards to give Nintendo a massive decade-long agreement to bring the biggest franchise in gaming to their platforms. Switch, next gen, and whatever else may come in the future. However it's going to play out and whatever hardware is involved, Nintendo will be getting Call of Duty for 10 years, according to Phil Spencer, if this acquisition happens, whereas Sony has been kind of crying about it in the corner, even though they already have a couple of years guaranteed anyway and plenty of time to develop a competitor. I find it sad coming from Sony, and I find it really interesting and exciting for Nintendo. And look, you guys know me. I'm a Nintendo fan first and foremost. They're my favorite company. I love the Switch, even though I am very ready for the next big hot thing. And I do like Call of Duty, by the way. So, seeing this news and knowing the biggest franchise, Call of Duty, which I enjoy, will be coming to Nintendo platforms if this all plays out this way, to me, it's very exciting and it's great news for everybody.